Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Yakkity Yak Fishing Podcast. Let me ask you a question. Does this story sound familiar? You're out there fishing, you go to cast, you get out there and you sling it as hard as you can, you see it hit the water, and immediately you start seeing fish jump about 10 feet past where you're casting. But today, hope to give you some tips and tricks to give you guys some more distance, give you guys some more accuracy, and get your bait out to where the fish are, so hopefully you can catch more fish. So let's get into it. Rustic, good morning, buddy. Brandon, good morning. Hope you guys are doing fantastic. It is definitely Saturday. It is definitely early. I'm not 100% ready for this, but we're going to roll with it anyway. Hope you guys are going fishing today. Hope you guys catch some toads. I do appreciate you stopping by and giving me a few minutes of your time this morning. So like I said, today on the Anyone Can Fish series, we were talking about casting, the science of casting, the tips and tricks of casting, and like I said, towards the end, I'll give you guys 3 more tips in order to take advantage of the way your body works biologically, the way physics works. Like I said, the science of casting to get you a little bit extra distance, a little bit extra accuracy, and hopefully put you guys on more fish. So casting a fish rod is not just an art, it is a science. It's something that using the way your body is made, the way that rods are made, and using physics can get you extra distance, get you accuracy, just getting your heavier baits or even lighter baits, depending on the scenario, out to where the fish are at. And one of the biggest key factors when it comes to this is actually the technique. There's different opinions rolling out there on the internet, but the general thesis is you want to start at a horizontal or a 2 o'clock position, either one. You want to accelerate through the cast and end on like a 10 o'clock position. And what this allows you to do is use leverage based both on the speed you're moving, that you're actually casting, but also the flex in your rod to get this extra distance. And the way a fishing rod is made can make a big difference as well. You got different actions, you got different powers of your rods. The power typically determines how big of a bait you can throw, but the action of the rod will determine how much force is needed to get that bait out, right? So if you're casting with a heavy weight and you're using a heavy rod, you're using heavy line, all this good stuff, it's going to take more power to get that bigger bait out, right? So by starting at this horizontal position or this 2 o'clock position and accelerating forward, you're going to get this launching effect, and that bait will go out into the water, through the guides, all that good stuff. But I mean, there are things that make a difference, right? So on your fishing rods, you're going to have some that have shorter handles, some that have longer handles. Your longer handled rods, typically you're going to get more distance out of. Your shorter handled rods, typically they're shorter casts, simply because the lever, which is the distance between the reel where your hand is sitting and the butt of the rod, which is the very bottom of the rod, that distance is shorter. If you look at any kind of physics textbook or anything like that, they talk about levers. The longer the lever, the more force can be applied to the object you're trying to cast out. In this case, you're trying to cast out the bait, right? Typically speaking, also, if you have a rod that has a longer handle, the rod itself is typically longer. Not always, but typically. For instance, a Mad Cat or a Slime Cat, any of those 12-foot rods typically have like a handle that's roughly 1.5 feet in distance or a little bit longer. Your surf casting rods, there's some of those that have like a 2.5 foot handle. And it's also quite common to see in carp fishing tackle also, these longer handles. And what that does is it allows you to have a bigger lever to get that bait out further. Morning, Rhonda. Morning, Dustin. No fishing today, Russ. I'm sorry to hear that, man. Hope everything's going good, and it's at least on purpose. Fishing for Whiskers, yeah, thanks for coming in. Thanks for listening and not watching while you're driving. Because obviously we'd be very sad if something happened. But I do appreciate you tuning in and listening. So like I said, you understand the physics of casting. Like I said, you have this lever, and the lever yourself is going to be the rod. But the force that you apply to said lever is actually your arm and your technique. Generally speaking, like I said, if you have your hand on your reel, or around your reel seat, however, it depends on the rod kind of reel you're using, right? Typically speaking, your hand's going to be by your reel, either above your reel slightly with a spinning reel, or at the bottom with either a bait caster or a spin cast reel. And then your other hand, like I said, in order to get maximum distance, you're going to want to make sure that the hand is as far away as possible from the other hand. So you want it to be as far away as possible. And by doing that, by having that further distance, when you go forward, right, you're pushing slightly with this hand just to get the rod away from you. But that bottom hand, the speed that you pull that bottom hand is what gives you that power. So ideally, you're starting back here and you're going forward, and it's like this, right? How fast this hand comes down, like you could leave this hand here and just do this, like keep your hand close to your face. How fast this hand moves, how fast the bottom hand, the one at the butt of the seat, how fast the bottom hand moves is what projects that bait out. So obviously, typically you're going to push the top hand that's by the reel out a little bit, but like I said, the main source of your power on your cast, the main source of power for your lever that you have is going to be the bottom hand at the bottom of the rod. And like I said, there's a couple different techniques floating around the internet about what is the best. There's several videos made by several different people. And obviously you have these outliers too, right? Some people have their own little funky looking technique. I know some guys do like a pendulum swing, especially in surf fishing, where you're partially loading the rod to start with and then launching your bait out. And they feel like that gives them more power. And then you have bass fishermen, trout fishermen, guys with smaller rods that are doing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of casts a day. Well, you don't want to put all your power on those, so that one's a little more critical to the technique, because you can use less power but have good technique and still get an average cast that's further. And that's again going to be based on your bait size, your rod length, bait weight, action of the rod, all that good stuff, right? So by taking that all into account, you can do different things. And another thing that people don't think about when it comes to casting, both for distance and for accuracy, is your line width, right? So if you're using a really, really heavy line, you're going to have more drag on your rod, because you're going to have more pressure on the guides of the rod. So when you launch this bait out, you have this constant little amount of drag where the line's sliding through the guides. And if you have a thicker line, you're going to have less distance. That pretty much is just a guarantee. Whereas if you use a thinner line, less contact with the eyes, you get a little more distance that way. Obviously, you don't want to use too light of gear, because if you throw in an 8-ounce sinker on 10-pound line, you're probably going to snap it every time you cast, right? But at the same time, on the other side of things, you don't want to throw a 2-ounce weight on 20-pound line, or a 30-pound line, or 40-pound line. The thicker you get, because again, you're limiting how far you can go. Because at that point, rather than the line being the issue, it's the weight, right? Because the lighter the weight and the thicker the line, you don't have as much pulling power from the bait you've launched at the end of it. So it kind of goes both ways. It's a sliding scale. But from a beginner standpoint, once you have your typical setup, you just use your whatever weight you wanted to go with, have it matched, and then by that margin, you'll have more distance casts and more accurate casts as you do more practice. And like I said, thinner lines, and this goes back down to even going to the type of line, right? Braid is going to have a smaller diameter than mono. So even something just as changing the line difference, the line type can be the difference between a long cast and a short cast. Your monos are thicker, your fluorocarbons are thicker, but then like I said, your braids are smaller for the same poundage, obviously, right? I mean, if you go slap 80-pound braid on a line, and it's going to be roughly the same diameter as 20 12 or 15 pound mono, and then you won't see the difference. And on top of that, you're damaging your gear more with the braid being rough around your guides and stuff like that. So it's just something to think about. But yeah, typically speaking, I mean, you want to use the smallest diameter line possible. And by doing that, you're going to be doing braid or you're going to be doing a smaller diameter mono. And again, when you have it matched out with your bait, it's going to make a big difference on your casting for both distance and for accuracy. Another thing that affects casting distance is going to actually be just wind. Wind's another big one that you don't really take into consideration. Obviously, if you're casting into the wind, you're going to have shorter distance than if you're casting against the wind. I'm sorry. If you're casting into the wind as opposed to with the wind, right? Like if the wind's blowing towards me and I'm casting away from me, you're going against the wind. You're going to get less distance that way too. And on top of that, some other problems that are get brought into play when you're casting into the wind is you're going to possibly end up with wind knots. You're possibly going to end up with line loops, which are just a bunch of extra line floating on top of the water. And there are some ways to mitigate that. I'll go over that in a little bit. But that, ideally, you want to cast with the wind. If the wind is blowing away from you, like from behind you forward, and you're casting forward, you're going to get more distance that way too. And it can be sometimes quite significant, especially if the wind's blowing quite hard. It can be the difference between getting your bait in front of those fish or not. And obviously, as fishermen, we want to get our bait in as fast as we can to those fish to be able to present our bait and hopefully be able to bring them in. So that was more about distance. Obviously, in this case, we're going to talk about accuracy as well. So typically speaking, when you're going distance casting, you're going to want to let some line out from your rod because you don't want your bait right at the tip of your rod, right? But the closer the bait is to the tip of the rod, typically you can get more accurate casts that way. But if you're going to do something where you're relying on accuracy more than distance, say you're fishing in a river with a bunch of overhanging trees, or you're casting up underneath a dock, or casting to a certain log jam, stuff like that, or if you're sight fishing, you're casting to a specific fish, you've been able to sneak up on it or whatever, and you want to make sure you put that bait right there because you got one shot kind of thing. You're going to want to have your bait as close to your rod tip as possible, even like an inch or two, because that way when you're pointing your rod, when you're swinging it forward, it's going to go exactly where you have it pointed at, right? Opposite for distance casting, obviously at that point you want to have your bait further away because then you've increased the length of this lever. You've increased the potential energy on this cast because you've made that distance longer, right? But what it all boils down to in the very, very end is that practice makes perfect. And this could be practicing out in your yard. This could be practicing out on the river just from fishing. I mean, there's different ways to look at it. I know a lot of people when they're teaching fly fishing, they'll take a paper plate and put it out in their yard. And the idea is you have to get that bait out on that paper plate consistently. I mean, you're looking at a 12-inch circle, and they're wanting you to hit a 1-foot target, which is quite insane. I don't know many people that can do that consistently on the regular. I do know some that can, but not very many. And it's absolutely insane to watch them do that because they're so accurate. And it can make a big difference. Again, if you're fishing somewhere with overhanging trees, you're fishing single boulders, you're fishing something that, you could very easily cast across, but you had to hit the specific spot, or you're hitting a tree, you're hitting a stump, or getting stuck, or whatever. You got to really hit those accurate spots. And so, again, with practice, eventually we're going to be able to hit those spots consistently, be able to hit those distances also, because again, it takes practice for both accuracy and practice for distance to be able to do these things. But like I said, I'm going to give you guys some tips also. If you're going to do distance casting, there are several guys that surf fish on the regular. Another thing that they like to do is actually set their bait all the way on the ground, right? Again, you've increased that distance by letting some line out. Put that that bait on the ground. That way, when you're going to go forward and you accelerate, you are completely, fully loading that rod. And some of them have great success with that. Like I said, me personally, I like to have my rod roughly horizontal. I don't like having the bait on the ground per se. But when I'm distance casting, I don't even do a back cast. Now, what's a back cast? A back cast is when you have the bait forward and you're lower going back with it, and then you're launching it forward, right? going back, and then instantly launching forward. That bait is never stopping in that motion. And what that does is it partially loads the rod. But if you're using heavier gear and heavier tackle, partially loading the rod can actually work against you. Because on top of the fact that you're wanting to, especially with the distance casting, you're wanting to get as far as possible. So you need all the energy going forward. Well, if you have this energy starting to go backwards, some of that energy is getting wasted going forwards also to make up that distance, right? If my back cast goes back 2 feet at, I'm not going to do numbers, specific numbers, right? Because I'm not a math magician, right? Okay, mathematician, however you want to call it. When you go back, you have to go forward. And so when you have this distance you've already created, and you have to make that up, you're having to make up that extra force to get that bait forward, and that's not what we want, in my opinion, right? So, like I said, this is again going with the guys that put their bait completely on the ground. They have zero force going backwards. Every bit of energy they put into that is going forward. Gives them more distance, gives them more height. That's what they're looking for. But this is where the whole accuracy goes into play, right? Because at that point, wherever your rod has went, your bait is following somewhere around that, right? If you don't cast perfectly straight in your distance casting, you're going to be off anywhere up to 15 to 20 degrees, either to the right or the left. It's going to get that distance, which is what we want. But that left or right is going to be completely uncontrollable. And that's where the back cast comes into play. If you're doing something where you need more accuracy, you're going to have back cast, and what that does is it allows you to go ahead and start aiming that rod where that bait's going to go and make you more accurate. So on top of the rods being a major factor in terms of the amount of power available, the way you cast them is going to determine how accurate or inaccurate you are, or how far or how short you cast. But the biggest thing, what it boils all down to, the biggest thing is technique. The second thing is gear. And the third thing is the goal, right? Yes, slinging sinkers off is not fun. It's expensive. It can get really hairy really quick. Dominic does do that, yes. So does Zach. So does Big Mike. They all do the... Well, I don't know if I take it back. I don't know if Big Mike actually puts his bait all the way on the ground or not, but I know Zach does. I know Dominic does. I know a couple other guys that do. Mike, I know, does it probably a little more like me, where it's not quite on the ground, but it's still a complete stop to a complete go and all the way through. Hey, 351, welcome in. If you guys are enjoying this, please hit the like button, and if you haven't subscribed, consider subscribing. I would greatly appreciate it. Lets me know that what I'm doing is something that's useful. Lets me know that I'm helping you guys out. And yeah, so back into it. Like I said, distance casting. Distance casting, the three major things I think about: you want as long of a lever as possible. So you're either a rod with a long handle, or you're going to increase the distance of that lever by letting more line out at the end of your rod tip. You're going to want your bait to not be moving backwards at all, because you want all of your force to go into your cast, right? So either A, like some people do, you have the bait completely on the ground at a complete stop, or B, you have it in a horizontal position at a complete stop. Then when you're going forward, you're slinging, you're loading your rod completely by stepping forward, even for that matter. You don't have to, but a lot of people actually step their body forward. And then you're pushing your reel hand, which is your upper hand, out. And at the same time, you're pulling the bottom hand, the one at the bottom of the reel, down as fast as possible. And the idea is that you put all that into this bait that's been sitting still. All of that force is going to get launched through the rod, to the rod tip, to the bait, and out it goes. From that point, the only thing that's keeping that bait from just going on forever and ever is the drag from the line, obviously gravity, right? And then whether or not you want to imply any kind of pressure on the line at that point to stop it. Like if you're casting for certain things and you overshot, and it does happen occasionally, if you overshoot your target, obviously one of the things you can do is pinch the line, and that'll straighten your line out, and then obviously it'll just go straight down like a rock into the water, which some people want. I know it's quite common in carp fishing, quite common practice to touch your line before it hits the water to straighten that out, because they're doing a lot of these little complicated rigs, which they want their leader to be as straight as possible, And by doing that, since you stop that sinker, that bait just goes a little past that sinker and then it'll go straight down into the water. And again, if that's the desired effect, then you're good to go. If you're catfishing, I don't know about you guys, but when I catfish, I don't really care if my leader's straight or not, as long as they can get to the bait, and as long as if I'm using a sliding sinker rig, as long as that line will go through the sinker. I don't care if it lands in a circle or if it lands on top of each other or whatever. And in my personal experience, the catfish don't care either, right? So in those types of situations, it does not matter if you touch the line or not. You want it to go out as far as possible. You don't ever touch that line, because as soon as it hits the water, you're good. Now, one of the things I did mention when it comes to distance casting, if you're worried about the wind, or you're casting with the wind, or even against the wind in this case, say we're casting against the wind. You go out, you launch this thing, it is going out and out and out and out for forever, seems like, right? Finally hits the water because you've done everything right. You've matched your tackle, you've matched your rod, you've matched your technique, all that good stuff, and you launch it out. If you don't touch that line and you're casting into the wind, you're going to notice very quickly you're going to have like this giant rainbow wave of line that starts going either to the left or to the right or back towards you because you end up casting up on accident or something like that. So you have this giant amount of line that's extra that you end up having to reel in. Well, the unfortunate thing about that when distance casting, especially if you're using smaller baits or going after specific targets even, is all of a sudden when you start reeling that line in, and this is even more of an issue with artificial lures. If you're wanting to run straight along a tree, and so you cast straight past that tree, but you got that giant bow in your line, what happens when you start reeling in? Well, that water against that extra line is going to cause drag, which will make your lure start going sideways. So you have this giant U you're covering with this fishing lure instead. It's not going in a straight line. It's not going straight by the target you want. It's going to follow that line. So in those situations, if you are casting into the wind, or if you're casting and you realize, oh, hey, I'm going to have a bunch of extra line because it wasn't quite right, that's when you're going to want to put your finger on the line and try to stop it before it hits the water to make that line as straight as possible. On the other hand, when you go back to the accuracy casting, that technique's a little bit different. Like I said, in that one, you're going to want to do your back cast, and the back cast is just where you start going backwards with the bait. And what this does, again, it helps align the target, the intended target of that lure. And so by doing that, when you go to launch forward, that variance to left and right is significantly smaller. That's where the back cast come in handy, especially if you ever watch somebody that's doing fly fishing, they're casting that fly rod, they're back casting sometimes 5, 6, 7, 8 different times. Part of that's to get more line out so they get more distance, but the biggest thing is for accuracy, because they want that fly to land specifically in a certain spot. They want their line to be as straight as possible, so that way that fly drifts as naturally as possible to the trout or whatever they're fishing for. With that being the case, it's more important to touch your line, to straighten that line out before it's the water, because your intended target is so small. And again, when you're distance casting, it doesn't matter so much. Yes, that is very true. Obviously, some rigs do better. Knocker rigs, where the bait is on the very end with the bait, or something like a Kentucky rig where the weight is on the bottom on a high-low rig. Those obviously do cast further because the weight is the end of the line. As opposed to like a Carolina rig where you end up having some drag. Obviously, the bait you're using can make big differences too, right? So, for those who didn't see, Rustic asked, or didn't ask, he stated that the way your bait is rigged determines distance as well. And this is, he makes a very, very good point. If all of the weight is at the end of the line, your bait is, your presentation is more aerodynamic, right? On the other hand, if you're using a Carolina rig and you're using just your bait and your hook and your sinker, it's going to be more aerodynamic than, say, something that's got the a Demon Dragon or a slip float or something that's odd on it as well. Same story goes for the type of bait you're using, right? If you're using big old bait, that's going to catch more drag in the air, right? As opposed to something that's smaller or something that's more streamlined. If you got something that's square as opposed to something that's cigar shaped or perfectly round or anything like that, then obviously that's going to catch drag in air as it goes across as well. And all those factors make a big difference. All of those can play into how much distance you get. And some of those things, keeping that in mind, some of those things can make or break your day. Because obviously, if I can't get the bait to the fish because the drag's coming too much, or say I'm fishing in the wind and it just completely, if I'm fishing a frog bait or something, I'm trying to cast at a specific lily pad and the wind picks up and it launches it 3 feet to the left into a tree, well, then obviously that's a problem. If I had downsized my frog or maybe used something with a smaller profile to go for that lily pad, then I would be more likely to hit that target, right? So it factors both in distance and in accuracy, because something with a bigger profile is going to catch more drag, both from wind, and from line in the water, because it takes more pressure to get those things going. Now, on the plus side to that, if you're using something with a heavy weight and you cast it out there and you do end up getting a bow in the line, it's more forgiving to have that bow in the line in, because that weight of that bait or lure will help drag yourself straighter more so than a lighter bait. If you have a lighter bait and a big bow, you're never getting that bait straight again. You might as well just recast, right? But on the same side, if you use a smaller profile bait and you get a bigger profile bait or a heavier bait, then when you cast it out and that bow and that line pulls, it's going to pull straighter. So it's more forgiving in that regard. Just something to think about, because everything you do, no matter what technique you're going for, whether it be for accuracy or distance, is completely affected by things such as bait size and bait profile. Morning, Tony. Thanks for swinging by. But, so another thing to consider, like I said, 3 tips at the end, right? This is the 3 tips. 3 tips: use as long of a rod as possible. This gives you as big of a lever as possible, and also it gives you more accuracy because it's able to be closer to where your intended target is. If you're going to go for accuracy casting, use a backswing. If you're going to go for distance casting, do not worry about a backswing. You want all the force going to that bait, so you want to just go from a complete stop to a complete go. And the third thing, like I said, the third tip is bait profile size, line weight size, just matching your tackle. If you're using a big bait, you're going to want a big rod. Something that's a little bit stiffer, something that's going to be fully loaded when you go to cast it. If you're using smaller baits, smaller lines, you can get away with, I'm going to say flimsier, but really it's just different, slower action rods, right? Something with more of a bend in the rod, more parabolic. You're not going to get as much distance that way, but you'll get more accuracy because it helps with that backswing and helps with the direction of that bait. Another thing to consider when it comes to rods, like I said, is that parabolic action. One of the quickest ways to break a rod, besides shutting in a door, yes, I've done it, it sucks, is overload it. Something with a slow action or a lighter weight is not going to be able to handle a giant bait. If I take a light action rod, and let's just say it's a light, fast action rod, so it's got a fast tip. It's stiff for a lightweight rod, right? It's going to be rated. Every rod's going to have a lure suggested rating and a line weight rating, right? They're there for a reason. If I'm slapping a 8-ounce weight on a light rod that's only rated for a quarter ounce, well, if I load that rod fully, yes, I'm going to get some distance out of that rod, but I am probably going to snap that rod in half. On the opposite end of that scale, if I have a rod that is medium heavy with a fast action tip, and I'm using a quarter ounce jig head, it's not going anywhere. I'd be lucky to get it to go 10 feet. It's just the way things go. Matching tackle is crazy important. Crazy important. The other way that works, again, this is all this is spectrum based, right? But you got to match it. And so it's something that you'll get used to as you're going out and doing things, but it's just something to keep in mind. By matching your tackle, you're going to get more distance and more accuracy. But back to the rods. If you have something that's got a slower action instead of a fast action, if I had a slow action if if I have a lightweight rod with a slow action, which means it has a parabolic bend, it bends all the way to the butt of the rod, it is more forgiving to throw heavier weights on rods like that because you've distributed the weight all the way across the rod. Because typically when a rod breaks, it's going to be either the tip of the rod or the butt of the rod. But the butt of the rod takes more punishment because you distribute that weight across the whole entire length of the rod, the whole entire shaft of the rod. By putting all that weight on the end with a fast action tip, that's where most people are going to break their baits or break their rods. Keeping that in mind, when you're doing these casting also, if you have a lot of weight on it, please make sure you open your bail if you're going to use a spinning reel or any other reel. If you put all of that force into it and you don't have the spool disengaged, you're going to start slinging rocks, slinging weights all the way across the river or the lake or pond or whatever. You're never going to get them back, so it's going to get really expensive really quick. So these little nuances, while you do have to think about it, by keeping it basic and just keeping the technique in mind, it's going to make a big difference for you. Like, if you're using heavy gear and you're going for bigger fish, accuracy probably isn't your number one priority, which is fine. Give me a second, guys. Sorry about that. All right, ow. Okay. Since your accuracy is probably not your number one priority, and your distance is, you're going to have your stuff matched bigger rods, bigger weights, bigger baits, bigger profile baits. That generally leads into the whole realm of, hey, I'm not worried about being accurate. I'm worried about getting my bait out far enough to where these fish are. And I want to make sure that when I get my bait out there, I can bring these big fish in. So that kind of typically leads into that type of strategy, right? A lot of times you're fishing for smaller fish, smaller gear, stuff like that. It tends to lean more towards the accuracy style of fishing. You're going to use the back cast. You're going to want to put your bait in a specific spot. And it's just a general kind of accepted practice, right? So as you do this more, you'll get more practice anyway, but keeping these things in mind, there are things you can do, right, to do these practice things. You can go out there with a rod with no weight at all. With a weight on it only, no hooks at all, and practice distance casting if you wanted to. You can do this in a yard, you can do it on a football field, you can do it out in a park, you can do it in a field, on the water, it doesn't matter. You can practice these techniques of how to get more distance without costing more than just a sinker at a time, potentially. Vice versa, if you want to go with lighter baits, you can take a hook or a jig or something, rig it Texas style, so that way you're not worrying about the hook getting caught on things, and cast these lighter weights. That way to practice accuracy. They also sell these little fake plastic dumbbell things you can tie on the end of a rod to practice casting with. They don't weigh a lot. You can get them bigger and smaller to be able to cast and practice these things also. And back to the whole, even if you're doing fly fishing, say you're using a fly rod, and you're going for this 1 foot plate, having a fly on there with the hook cut off allows you to keep casting over and over again without getting stuck, which is helpful for both inconvenience and with loss of tackle. So, like I said, the science of casting, you're using a lever and you're applying force to a bait at the end of a line, and the way you apply that force is going to determine distance or accuracy or both, and will allow you to get that bait out in front of those fish, so that hopefully when you go fishing again, you do cast out. When you do cast out and the bait hits the water, the fish are jumping around the bait as opposed to just past the bait or out past the bait further. So I hope it helps you guys out. If you got any questions, let me know. Shoot me a comment, shoot me an email. If you do want to email me, you can email me at yakshoreoutdoors@yahoo.com with any comments, concerns, questions about casting or about the show in general. So thanks again, guys. And again, I hope this helps, and we'll see you guys next time on Yakkity Yak Fishing Podcast. Alrighty. Every cast I make, I'm just having my sinker and bait work into the river or not. That's true. Rhonda, casting takes practice. It's not a big deal. You'll get better over time. Yes, Rustic, I do agree that certain reels cast further than others. There's reasons why certain ones have good reputations. There's a reason why certain ones sell more. I guess I didn't even cover that part. Rustic also mentions that his team catfish spin cast without throw on distance over his Penn spin casting reel. So even from brand to brand, model to model, certain things can change how much casting you can get, right? Your bait casters are typically not going to cast as accurate as a spinning rod. And actually, typically, they won't even cast as far as a spinning rod of the same size, right? Obviously, if I'm using a small 2000 series spinning reel versus a big Abu Garcia C7000 bait casting reel that holds way more line, I'm probably going to get more distance out of that bait caster simply because there's more line and it's got typically you're using a bigger weight with it, right? But if you compare styles of reels of the same size, typically from least distance to most distance, you're going to be spin casting, bait casting, and then spinning reel. Typically, those are the three, right? Well, what makes that difference, right? So on a spinning reel, the thing that makes the biggest difference on distance is going to be the height of the spool. And I say height because the further you go out line-wise, the less lines on that spool. Remember that drag thing with the eye guide or the guides of the rod I was talking about? That drag also is affected on the spool of the spinning reel because it has that disc on top that is dragging against it as it's coming off that spool. Well, it's going to have more line at that same width, right? So you get more distance that way. If you have a shorter spool, doesn't matter how wide it is, it's going to have more drag constantly because as that line comes off, it's getting smaller and smaller width-wise. On a bait caster, the biggest thing that causes drag on a bait caster is going to be whether or not you have one of the auto spool feeders on the top, the line guide. They actually have it's a line guide on the reel itself that goes back and forth. If you go to cast, that line guide doesn't move, so it causes drag the whole entire time, just like another line guide would on the rod. But the idea, obviously, is if it's when you're reeling, it's called an auto level guide, and it moves the line back and forth on the bait casting spool to get your line spooled evenly across it. If you're using a bait caster and you're going for distance and you're not so worried about that, or if you're going to try to guide it by your thumb, then if you want more distance, you don't want that auto level on there. That'll give you more distance because you have less drag. But again, when you go to reel in, if you don't guide it, you're going to have a spool that has no line on the edges and has a giant wad of line in the middle. And then obviously the spin cast, the limitation on the spin cast is actually the shell on the outside of it, right? Because the way it's built, you have it's a spot about this wide in the reel itself that's filled with line, along with a disc with a little knob, and that knob is what actually guides the line onto it as it spins. But then it has to come out of that shell, which is a little hole in the top, right? So you have your disc, your lines catching this knob, it's going diagonal through this hole, so you have tension here, and then you have all the line guides. Those typically are not going to cast as far simply because of that. But for somebody who's just beginning on casting or just beginning fishing, they're a lot more forgiving because it's a push button. So it's not, you don't have to worry about having all the nuances of casting with a bait caster spinning reel, which typically involve using your fingers to help guide the line, whether it be to keep it from bird nesting with a bait caster or with holding the line from the beginning to start with the casting, have remember to let go of it while you're going forward. So there's caveats to everything, right? Thanks, Ron. I'm looking forward to it too. It should be interesting. It's a different style tournament. A lot of my tournaments I do are big fish. This is the first one I've done that's numbers of fish, so we'll see how it goes. Tony, you make a good point. Yes, if the line guide's in the middle, it'll help a little bit, but obviously you're still gonna have drag when it's on the sides of the reel. Um, but again, if you look at any of the distance casting competitions, almost all of those guys use spinning reels, and it's just the science of the reel itself. Now, granted, those probably aren't going to be used for fishing, so it's kind of a tomato to apple type comparison, right? But the reason they use spinning reels is because of the less drag and the more line, less resistance on the line. They're going to use huge guides on the rod, and then also they're using long rods. So I mean, it's just at that point it's a matter of micromanaging science, right? Obviously, from a practical perspective, I would agree with you. For most people, are going to be using the bigger weights on the bait casting reels because they're targeting bigger fish or whatever. Then yeah, you have a rod with longer handle, all that stuff. But I will say, in my personal experience, that the rods I have with the big spinning reels and that are longer, like my carp fishing rods, or my 9-foot whisker seekers with the spinning reels, I typically get more distance out of those than I do with the bait casters, unless I'm launching like a 6-ounce sinker. If I'm going with a 6-ounce sinker and a big cut piece of bait, then I'm worrying about overloading the rod at that point. So again, just matching the tackle is the big key there, in my experience. For y'all that are still here and watching, what do you guys think about the lighting setup this time? I tried doing some different stuff, bought some different lights, and I would be curious to see how the audio is too, because this way I'm able to use my fan without having the shadows. I don't think it's picking up on the microphone, but if it is, let me know. And lights wise, I'm trying to make it so it's not. Last time I had the giant white glare in my glasses while I was looking at the camera, which I wasn't a fan of. But I also had some really harsh shadows behind me last time, so hopefully this setup's a little bit better. If you guys have some ideas for improvement, I'm more than happy to hear about it. For those of you just joining us, we've been covering casting, the science of casting, talking about levers, talking about matching tackle, using different types of tackle to get different goals, whether it be accuracy or distance, trying not to overload rods, but at the same time using good technique to either be more accurate by using a back cast and not worrying about so much about distance, or by using complete force and complete leverage to get as much distance as possible without worrying about accuracy. We also talk about minor things such as dealing with the wind, about how casting with the wind gives you more distance and more accuracy, and then some ways to combat the wind in terms of getting giant bows of line when you do cast into it and dealing with that. All right, cool, Tony. Thanks, man. Yeah, I got a feeling that whenever I do finish up this office, that where I end up having the computer, probably pick up the fan more. So I'm gonna have to think of a different way for that. Whether it be get a small window AC unit and just freeze it in here before I start, or what, I'm not sure. We'll have to figure that out as we go. Yeah, that's true. But obviously that's really bad reflective, right? So I mean, it's just a matter of changing some things and some positions and stuff to make it not as bad. I also noticed my laptop fan is being a little loud today too. It wasn't this loud last time either, so I'm not sure if it's catching both of them or just the one on the ceiling. Because well, I'll have to check it out and see on the replay. Excuse me. Well, like I said, if y'all are going fishing today, I hope you catch some toads. If nothing else, I hope this helped you at least think about it, casting, and maybe give you some pointer to try out next time you to get more distance and more accuracy. I do appreciate you guys swinging by today, hanging out and checking it out. And for those that don't know, I am doing the live show on Saturday, but what I'm doing is I'm actually cutting this up and putting it out as a video podcast as well. So that's why some of the weird pauses and why I don't necessarily announce that I'm talking to you guys and whatnot. Just make it easier to cut up, just so I can try to reach more people. Hey Ernie, good morning, buddy. Hope you and Christy are doing well. Sorry, Chrissy. Hope you and Christy are doing well. We've been talking about casting, both distance and accuracy, base casting, and some things to do to help with that. Matching tackle, trying to cast with the wind as opposed to against the wind. Try not to overload the rod, and then good technique. Being back casting for accuracy cast to be able to help keep your whole entire swing straighter, or with distance casting where you're not worried about it, just starting from a complete stop so that all your force is going into your bait to get maximum distance. What kind you planting this time? Are you doing a little bit of everything? And also, in case you guys didn't know, Rhonda pointed it out earlier, I am fishing in a tournament tonight. It is the Avid and Robbins Who Sunk My Battleship tournament. This is day 2. The first day had a different group of people fishing. And then today I'm in that group. It's from 6 p.m. this afternoon until midnight Eastern Standard Time. It's just like regular game Battleship. Rhonda and Avid are the team captains. And the goal is every time somebody catches a fish, they get to fire a shot towards the other team. And the idea is that they're trying to sink all the ships on the other side. There are some nuances. If you catch I think it's a 35 and a 45 pound fish, different things can happen. You can either take bait away, somebody's favorite bait away for an hour, or make a fish with a mini rod, such as a Barbie pole or a Dock Demon for an hour. It is being live streamed. It'll be on, I don't know if they're doing it on both channels or not. It'll either be on Avid Fishing or it's going to be on Adventures of Robin C. I'll share that link out on the community page for everybody later. And yeah, I hope you guys are there. Like I said, from 6 p.m. till midnight. It's a numbers-based tournament. Obviously, the more fish we catch, the more shots we get to fire, the faster we can sink their ships. If I'm able, I'll share it to my stream too, but I don't know if the hosts have that set up. So we'll have to see. Oh no, I'm well aware they're legit, and I have one. I need to respool it before tonight, so I'll have to do that too. But it's only a 3 rod limit, so I'm gonna be taking my spinning rods tonight with the bait runners, because like I said, I'm gonna go after smaller fish, and with them being channel cats, I want them to actually be able to alert me if they have a bite, but obviously at the same time they can handle a bigger fish. So I'm not taking the super heavy stuff today. Be a little bit lighter, and I'm probably gonna fish to the dam. But it just depends on how many people are there. If there's a lot of people there, I'll either fish downriver a little bit off one of the piers, or I might go up on the lake hand side and fish off the rocks above the dam on that deep side, We'll just have to see what happens. And with it being a 3 rod limit, if I do fish the day, I'll probably have one vertically suspended on that wall, one cast into one of the holes on this of the dam itself, and then probably run a float rig on the last one and drift the eddy that's caused by the turbine. If it's the other way around, if I'm fishing off that pier, I'll probably do a similar setup, but I'll also have one cast out more towards the channel and one shallower, and then have a float rig in the middle probably. Because there's one pier in particular that's got a big tree right downriver from it, and it could be good. But that way I'm fishing all the water column. These fish are finally starting to come off spawn, so I do imagine there'll be some big fish caught, at least on my side of it. And it's like me per se, but just like in the south, I do know there's some people fishing from up north as well, and so they may still be in spawn up there. So again, with it being a numbers tournament, it doesn't matter so much. Obviously, the bigger fish just makes it a little more entertaining, and obviously has those nuances of getting rid of their bait, or one of them makes them, like I said, they get to downsize one of their rods to the dock demon. Another one was to make it so they got rid of a bait they liked. There was something else too. I can't remember what the other one was. I'm sure that they'll go over it, I'm sure, at the beginning of the tournament. So it'll all be out for everybody to see. But again, that's at 6 p.m. tonight, Eastern time, and it goes until midnight. So we'll just have to see how it goes. With that being the case, I'm going to go ahead and close this down. My wife and daughter are supposed to be getting up in 8 minutes, so I'm going to go see them and have breakfast with them, and then we're actually running to either Bass Pro Academy or both. I got to get some more sinkers and stuff for tonight, so that's the game plan for today, is go hit those stores, get some more gear, and then get ready for this evening. So again, thanks for swinging by, guys. This has been Anthony with Yak Outdoors. I hope you guys have a fantastic day and a fantastic weekend, and I look forward to seeing you guys next week on the Yakkity Yak Fishing Podcast.